Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video I'm going to look at 3 small cheap utility modules that I think offer a huge amount of bang for your Eurorack buck. These are the Takaab RLFO, which is a combined LFO, noise source and sample and hold, the Ladik A-410, which is a voltage controlled crossfader and panner, and the Doepfer A-160-2 clock divider. I really want to show that you don't need to spend loads of money on big fancy expensive modules to add a heap of new functionality to your case. The 3 modules I'm looking at here are all just 4 HP wide. You could pick up all 3 of them and still have change of £200. Now, utility modules don't have the same kind of instant appeal as oscillators, filters or effects, the things that actually generate and process the sound itself. But for me, it's devices like these that really unlock the possibilities of modular and help you get more out of your system. So I'm going to look at each of the 3 in turn and run through a bunch of examples of things you can do with them, from simple and obvious to slightly more complex and unusual. Hopefully you'll get some patch ideas for your own setup, even if you don't own these exact modules, because the key functions I'm looking at here, sample and hold, crossfading and clock dividing, are all pretty common. Anyway, as usual, I've added a timing index so you can jump around, and before we start, here's a quick taste of what's coming up. So let's start by looking at the Takaab RLFO. If you're just starting out in Eurorack or building up a small system, this has to be one of the best value modules around. For about £55 or 66 US dollars, you get an LFO with 2 wave shapes, plus a white noise source, both of which are normal to a sample and hold, which also has slewing capability. When you patch in external signals to the sample and hold, you can use the noise and the LFO outputs for something else, so it's super flexible. As your system grows, you'll probably end up getting more powerful dedicated modules for some of these functions, but if space and money is at a premium, I really think this is a no-brainer. So what can you actually do with it? First up, you can use the square output of the LFO as a simple clock. It's obviously not as powerful as a dedicated clock module like Pamela's new workout, but sometimes you just want to trigger something at regular intervals by plugging a patch cable and turning a knob. Here I'm using it to clock a Turing machine, which is feeding a pitch sequence to an oscillator. The LFO also has a triangle output which you can use as a conventional modulation LFO to control filter cutoff, for example. Here I've just patched it to the CV input of a low-pass filter. So next up there's a white noise source. This is normal to the signal input of the sample and hold, but you can also tap the output directly. It sounds like this. And you can use that for anything else you fancy, like noise-based percussion patches, or to mix with other oscillators to add a bit of grit to a synth patch. Here I'm taking that noise through a bandpass filter and a VCA, and I'm triggering an envelope with the square output of the RLFO, which is triggering a very short snappy envelope which is controlling the VCA to give me a kind of hi-hat patch. Now the bottom section of the RLFO is the sample and hold, and with nothing patched to either of the inputs, the white noise source internally will be sampled on every cycle of the internal square wave LFO, which gives you a stream of stepped random voltages whose rate you can control with the LFO knob. Here I'm just using it to control filter cutoff again. And you can use the slew control to make those steps glide from step to step. This can be great for really kind of slow, subtle, smooth random modulation when you just want to add a little bit of movement to a patch. So you can patch another CV source into the signal input, and then you can use the sample and hold to sample that modulation. So here I'm feeding it a looping function from Contour 1. I've just got this in loop mode, and it's basically a rising saw wave. I've attenuated a bit so it's kind of covering a couple of octaves range. Going to the signal input, I'm using the internal square wave to clock that. I'm taking a copy of that square wave to pluck this LPG, and I'm just quantizing the output of the sample and hold, feeding it into the vol per octave of this oscillator, which is feeding a square wave into the LPG, and it gives me a kind of arpeggiator. And I can play with the attenuation of the function to increase the range, and the rise time of that function to create these longer arpeggio patterns. And I can control the rate of that sampling with the RLFO knob here. And of course you could use an external clock if you wanted to sync this to the rest of your patch. Now, if nothing's patched to the signal input of the sample and hold, then every time it gets a clock on the clock input, it will sample the internal white noise source and effectively give you a new random voltage which it will hold every time it gets a trigger in there. So if you feed it a trigger on every note of a sequence, you'll get this kind of per note random voltage which you can use to modulate something like envelope decay or filter cutoff or any other parameter you like. It's really good for giving random variations or accents to a simple synth patch. Here's a simple 5-note sequence playing into rings, and I'm taking a copy of the trigger into the sample and hold. And if I bring up the amount of that sample and hold of CV on the brightness, you can hear that every note now has a slightly different brightness applied. Immediately makes it a lot more dynamic and interesting. So one other cool effect you can try with a sample and hold is analog downsampling. Feed an audio signal into the input and a very high frequency audio rate oscillator to the trigger input, and the output will be a kind of blocky approximation of the input waveform. Here's a triangle wave, and I'm going to use a high frequency square wave from another oscillator to feed the clock input. It sounds like this. And as I reduce that clocking frequency, you get a progressively blockier approximation of the triangle wave that I'm feeding in. And you end up with something that sounds like artifacts from a low quality digital to analog converter, but it's obviously a fully analog signal path. You can run a full mix or a drum bus or something through that for a creative effect, but it's also quite good to use at the oscillator stage. And if you are feeding a sequence to both oscillators which are tracking together, then you can kind of adjust the ratio between them and end up with some interesting wave shapes. Here's just a sequence from the Moskwa. I'm sending a copy of the pitch CV to both. As I bring that kind of pitch control down on the clocking oscillator, you can see some quite interesting waveforms on the scope here. And tune into a nice ratio that works. I'm just going to take some of the gate from the sequence to pluck the LPG. Just by playing with this clocking pitch, you can get some really nice blends. Next up, let's move over to the Doepfer A-160-2 clock divider. This is the most expensive module of the three that I'm looking at today, but you can still pick up one of these for less than £90 brand new. So a clock divider basically takes a stream of clocks, gates or triggers at the input and spits out slower versions of these at various divisions of the input rate. So the divide by 2 output, for example, outputs 1 gate or trigger for every 2 that it gets at the input. The divide by 4 produces 1 for every 4, and so on. On the Doepfer there are 7 different outputs, and you can switch between 3 ranges for them. There's 2 to 8, there's prime numbers from 2 down to 17, and there's powers of 2 from 2 down to divide by 128. There's also a gate mode and a trigger mode. Gate mode basically keeps the output high for half of the division, no matter how long the input trigger is. And trigger mode, the outputs are the same length as the input trigger. So whether they're short triggers or long gates, the outputs will match those. Again, a module like Pamela's new workout does include a lot of this kind of functionality, but it's often a lot more immediate to use a dedicated module like this. Plus it has 1 or 2 other tricks up its sleeve that are a little bit harder to replicate. Before we get to those tricks, here I've just set it up to generate a simple drum pattern for some drum modules on my other rack that's just off screen. I'm basically feeding a clock from the RLFO to the input here, and I'm taking the divide by 2 output to a closed hi-hat, the divide by 4 output to a kick drum, and the divide by 8 to a snare. And I can just take this one, which is going to a rim shot. Let's take it to the divide by 5 just to kind of add a slightly more syncopated element to the rhythm. Now obviously this is pretty basic, but it's a very quick way of getting some simple rhythms going. Now we can get some much more complex drum patterns by feeding an irregular clock to the input here and using some of the more unusual divisions. Here I'm pairing it with Pamela's new workout, which is feeding a Euclidean trigger pattern, 13 steps out of 16 to the input, so it's not quite steady. I'm feeding a reset signal every 2 bars to kind of keep this from getting too chaotic. And I'm just taking a 4/4 kick output from Pam's to anchor the kick drum, just so we've got something to kind of anchor this rhythm against. I've got a closed hat, rim shot, snare, open hat and clap from these first 5 division outputs. So this is on the 2 to 8, so that's divided by 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. And we've got this quite interesting pattern that resets itself every 2 bars. I can flick to the primes, which will then be divided by 2, 3, 5, 7 and 11, which gives us a slightly sparser, different pattern. And if we play with the number of Euclidean triggers we're sending in as well, so let's go down to 11 out of 16. And let's try flicking to the 2 to 1, 2, 8. Something much sparser but still quite regular. Back to the primes. Let's up the number of Euclidean triggers again. Let's go up to 14. Let's go back to 2 to 8. So you can see just by varying a few simple parameters like the number of Euclidean triggers, which divisions we're using, which outputs we're using, we can get a huge range of rhythmic possibilities just from tweaking a few of those things. So moving away from purely drum triggers, we can use a clock divider as a timed switch controller. The gates that are generated can open switches or VCAs that allow modulation through to something else in our patch for a specific amount of time that's related to our master clock, kind of like a track and hold. For example, here I've got one output triggering a kick drum, and I've got another, the divide by 16 output, controlling this switch, which is switching between 2 different LFOs that are modulating this filter. So 1 bar with the slow LFO, 1 bar with the faster one. So as well as controlling switches, we can also use these gates themselves as simple stepped modulation sources. Here I've got the Moskwa playing a simple sequence on the Roved in wavetable mode, and I've taken a couple of these divisions to the timbre and morph inputs which control the row and column of the wavetable. If I increase the amount of modulation on those attenuverters on the input, we can get these nice timbral changes that are kind of tied to the beat. Sound that evolves over the bar. And I can take another division, which I'm going to take through this attenuator on quadrat to the transpose input of the sequencer. So I can have alternate bars jumping up an octave. All from a simple clock in. Everything's related to the main tempo because everything's synced together. So you can even use a clock divider as a kind of sequencer if you mix some of the outputs together through a mixer and then run that result through a quantizer. Here I've got a regular clock coming in from the RLFO, and I'm taking the divide by 2, 4, 8 and 16 outputs into this matrix mixer. I'm taking the mixed output from output A, this first column, into the distinct quantizer. That's feeding the volt per octave of the Kaliosk. That's going through a wave folder with nothing really happening at the moment into the Optimix LPG. And every time the quantizer re-quantizes, when it gets a new value, it's sending out a trigger, which I'm using to ping the LPG. So we're just getting this little sine wave pinging LPG sequence. And just by adjusting the ratio of these various elements, we can change the sequence slightly. And of course, when we switch to slightly less regular clock division outputs, we get much more interesting rhythms as well. Let's go to 2 to 8. Slow the tempo down slightly. We get this nice kind of swung triplety feel because we've got the divide by 3 and divide by 5 in the mix. Now we can also use the other outputs of the matrix mixer to create different related stepped outputs that we can use as complex stepped modulation. If I take output B, which I've just set these pots to slightly different positions, let's take that to the wave shaping input of the oscillator. And let's take output C, since we've got access to that too. Again, I've just set the knobs to different positions. Let's take that to the folder, the timbre input there. So now we've got kind of related modulation lanes, if you like, which are kind of all related to the same timing divisions, but work in slightly different ways because of the way they're mixed. So finally, if you feed the Doepfer clock divider an audio rate signal from an oscillator, you can use it as a crude sub-oscillator. So the divide by 2 to divide by 8 outputs will produce unipolar square waves at divisions of your input frequency, which progress down the subharmonic series. Let me show you what I mean. So this is the square wave output of my oscillator, and I've got another output of it going into the input of the clock divider. This is the pitch. And if I take the divide by 2 output, it'll be a square wave that's half that pitch, so an octave lower. As I step through, so they're moving down the subharmonic series there. You can even combine those to get chords and sort of crazy glitchy drones. I actually made a separate, much more detailed video all about this recently, which I'll link to in the description. Here's a little taste of it, and do check out the full video if you're interested in this technique. Okay, finally we have the A-410 from Ladik, who make dozens of really useful and functional modules which have quite a similar aesthetic to Doepfer. The A-410 is another module that's really great value for money. It's about the same price as a Takaab, that's about £55 in the UK. You can use it in two ways. You can use it to crossfade between two inputs to one output, or you can pan one input to two different outputs. Super simple to use. You just select the mode with this switch, pan or mix. The inputs are at the top, the outputs are at the bottom. There's a manual pan or mix control here, and there's a CV for that with a attenuator on the input there too. So probably the most obvious use for this module is as an audio crossfader. You can use a control voltage to morph between two outputs of an oscillator, two outputs of a filter, or two complete voices, or anything you like really. Here I've got the square wave output of an oscillator going into filter 8, and I'm taking the low pass output, the two-pole low pass, and the high pass output into the two inputs of the crossfader. That's the low pass, and that's the high pass. I'm just manually panning between them. And if I set the pan in the middle, and I take an LFO to the input, and just increase the amount of modulation from that, I can automatically pan between the two. So you can also use the A-410 as a CV crossfader, not just for audio. So here I've got the inputs are two different speed LFOs coming out of Oct, and I'm using the output to control the CV input on a filter, displaying a static pitch. I'm using a third slower LFO to control the crossfade from the same Oct, and you can hear we're just kind of morphing between these two LFO shapes. So if we just use a fixed voltage on the CV input, we can use this as a voltage controlled switch. This way it will simply switch between one input to the other when the input voltage goes high with no fading. Here I've got two different gate patterns, which are just using to ping a low pass gate with a static oscillator going into it. And I'm using a third pattern from Pamela's new workout to control the switch every bar. So we're going from one bar of one pattern to one bar of the other. So if you leave one of the inputs disconnected, you can also use this as a simple VCA, which is always really handy if you run out. Just set the pan control fully counterclockwise, connect your source to input 2, in this case just the output of an oscillator, and I'm just going to use an envelope from Contour 1 which I can manually trigger into the CV input. And basically whenever that voltage goes high, it'll open up that signal and let that through, which sounds like this. Of course, you could switch to the other input and you get an inverted behavior where the VCA would normally be open and the control voltage would close it. That can be really useful if you want to do sidechaining effects. So crossfading can get really fun when you start playing with it at audio rates. I love using a switch or a crossfader as a waveform splicer. By taking two different simple wave shapes and switching between them at different points in their cycles really fast, you get some really harmonically rich, interesting waveforms. So here's the sine and the square going into the two inputs, and I'm just using an LFO to pan between them. But if I speed that right up into oscillator territory, there are lots of sweet spots here where these waveforms will merge. Okay, you probably want to put your headphones on for this one or listen in good stereo speakers. If we flick it into pan mode, then the most obvious use is as a voltage-controlled stereo panner. Here I've got a simple sequence being played from Roved, which is going into the input, and I'm using this oscillator in LFO mode to slowly pan between the left and right outputs, which are going into the stereo inputs of my sound card. But as is often the case in modular, things get a bit more interesting when you bring things up to audio rate. So if I flick this LFO back into oscillator mode, let's bring up the amount of that modulation. And let's take a copy of the same pitch CV that's going into the sequence, from the sequencer into the Roved. Let's take that into the oscillator too. And then by playing with this relative frequency, you can get everything from kind of subtle chorusing to more AM kind of strange clangy tones. If I just fade that modulation down again, remember that's the raw sound. Gives it a nice kind of stereo warmth at that kind of ratio. There's all these different relative frequency ratios that work in different ways. Get these nice kind of clangy, FME, AME sort of sounds. So you can also use the pan mode as a voltage-controlled signal router, for example, to send one oscillator output to two different filter and effects chains. Here I've got a square wave output from this oscillator, being controlled by the Moskva sequencer. That's going into the input of the pan mix, and I've got the first side here, which I'm just pan to manually. I've got no CV control as yet. That's going into an LPG and spring reverb. A bit of feedback. If I pan to the other side manually, I'm feeding the same square wave into this bandpass filter and VCA, controlled by this envelope, into a bit of digital reverb from Monsoon. And I'm just summing the two effect outputs together at unity gain, which means that the effects tails kind of ring out smoothly as I crossfade, rather than crossfading at the end of chain where the effects tails would be reduced in volume as we switch over. Now if I just take an LFO, pan this to the middle, this LFO will just automatically pan it from one chain to the other. And I can play with these effects a little bit. And those effects tails ring out nicely even as it switches to the other chain. So there you have it, 21 quick ideas for things to do with these cheap, simple utilities. There's obviously plenty more things I haven't covered here, but I do hope this has given you some ideas for things to try. As always, if you've enjoyed this, please do like, subscribe, leave a comment, tell your friends. I'll be back soon, so until next time, thanks for watching.